all in part two, and I'm very much looking forward to more patronising speeches from Michael Woodhouse lecturing the House on ACC. And I just want to say to the member, I think you have to be here a little bit longer than 15 months to be that patronising. I think it's something that you should just build up to. Talk to Mr. Peachy next year. He'll explain to you how this place works. But I just thought, or maybe not, maybe Mr. Woodhouse could explain to Mr. Peachy how this place works. I don't know. Sort it out amongst yourselves. The fact is, I think we didn't deserve that level of arrogance from that member, given that he didn't answer a number of the very serious concerns that we've been raising. I'll get there, Ms. Goodhue. I'm responding to the comments made by one of your colleagues. And I want to say that Ms. Goodhue could get to her feet and actually answer some of the questions that members on this side of the House have been raising. She says that it's just personal attacks. Well, the Labour members say that this bill is an attack on every single vulnerable victim of an accident in New Zealand, and the National Party should take it a little bit more seriously. And I want to pick up the question that my colleague Darren Hughes asked when he said that this legislation is going to result in New Zealanders paying more and getting less. And I absolutely agree. And I want the next National Party Speaker, or indeed the Minister and the Chair, to stand up and absolutely guarantee that not a single person in New Zealand will pay more for ACC and get less. If they're saying we're wrong, then can they absolutely guarantee that that is not what this legislation will result in? Because, Mr. Woodhouse, who refuses to answer the question, the fact is that's exactly what this legislation will do.
Point of order.
Chair, I wish to draw to your attention that thus far in this particular debate, Speaker's Ruling 1085 would appear to indicate to us that this member has not yet addressed Part 2, the provisions in Part 2 of this bill, not mentioned in any respect that part of the bill. And I wonder if you could perhaps rule on that.
Yes, I understand the point that the member is making. I have just assumed the chair, so I haven't had time to apply myself to the nature of the very content of this part. But I think it's a timely warning that this is actually about addressing Part 2 of the bill, and I'd ask the member to come forth.
And perhaps Ms. Goodhue needs to read Part 2 of this bill, which actually refers to levies, if she thinks that the cost...
Order.
Okay. Levies. There, are you happy? Can I now talk about the cost on New Zealanders? I said the word levies. Is Ms. Goodhue happy now? Because the fact is, this legislation, and I notice how sensitive the National Party are, that they don't like us talking about the cost on New Zealanders. But the reality is that the cost for New Zealanders will go up and they will get less service because of this legislation that Ms. Goodhue and her National Party colleagues are voting for, Mr. Chair. And I think that the next National Party Speaker needs to absolutely categorically state that that is not the case. And I guarantee you, Mr. Chair, they will not do that, because they can't do that, and they know that all the evidence that the Select Committee heard, all the evidence that came out in the PricewaterhouseCoopers report shows that New Zealanders will get less and they will be paying more. Now, I spoke on Part 1 in this bill last night, and one of the questions I raised, which also comes up in Part 2 under Clause 51, wasn't addressed, which is the fact that someone who has a large fine, who pays that fine, can keep their ACC entitlement. Someone who has a large fine who can't pay it and ends up going to prison for the non-payment of that fine, can be or will be disentitled from ACC under this legislation. And I'd like the Minister and the Chair to answer that question, because I want to know why, and we've heard a lot of argument and rhetoric around this clause about how this is all about the worst of the worst and this is all about Graham Burton. But I actually want to ask a serious question, which is, how is it fair that someone who can pay their way out of a large fine can keep their ACC entitlement, but someone who can't and ends up going to prison, so ends up with a custodial sentence, does lose their entitlement? And if Mr. Woodhouse, who appears to be the guru on all this, would answer that question, I would very much... he says it's a nonsense question, which I think just shows exactly the colour of this National Party. Under this legislation, Mr Woodhouse, someone who commits exactly the same offence, but can't pay the fine, gets to go to prison and they lose their ACC entitlement. But someone who can pay the fine because they're wealthy gets to keep their ACC entitlement. It's an outrageous insult on the judiciary. Well, we're passing legislation here, Mr Woodhouse, that will be enacted, and I think we should be clear, and this is something which could be fixed if the government cared enough about this to fix it. Instead of standing up and making patronising speeches which don't address any of the concerns that members on this side have, then maybe the government could look at Mr Chair. Thank you very much, Mr Chair. Maybe the government could look at fixing these anomalies and taking some of these concerns a bit more seriously than they are. And the other issue that I raised last night was instead of only talking about the Graham Burtons, which we all agree was a serious issue, and that's why ACC has the ability to disentitle. And I would say to members on the other side of the House, maybe they should look at the reasons why ACC aren't using that power and resolve those. And one of the questions the Select Committee asked was, is it about information sharing? Because ACC said one of the problems is we don't know when people have been convicted. How can we disentitle people who we don't know whether or not they've been convicted? And if the issue is information sharing between departments, then that should be fixed. And I would like the next National Speaker or the Minister and the Chair to tell us that that has been fixed, because we could fix that in this legislation. We could make it absolutely clear that that information can be given directly to ACC so that they can use the power they have to disentitle where that's appropriate, Mr Chair. Now, the other thing that I would like to raise is the concerns that were raised by the Legislative Advisory Committee. And this is a committee, and Mr Woodhouse is very concerned about good practice and good law. Well, this committee had a lot to say about this legislation, and in particular the fact that we're now reversing that entitlement, because currently the Minister can't disentitle. It's ACC who does it, and I think it is appropriate that there is that separation. But what this legislation does is it says the Minister can entitle someone, but there's nothing in here which has any criteria around that. So we're now giving a power to a minister who can be lobbied, who can be politically persuaded. I mean, they've done a deal with ACT over this legislation and other pieces of legislation. They hated the three strikes law. It was only going to Select Committee. Now they've done some deal to support something else, probably this legislation, and now they think three strikes is wonderful. Ministers deal in politics. Ministers make political decisions. Well, now a minister has a right to entitle someone to ACC. This is not something which is sitting apart from the politics and from the department. And the Legislative Advisory Committee said that in that section there should be criteria around how that is to be made. And I would like the next National Speaker or the Minister and the Chair to explain why there is not criteria in this legislation for this power. How are we going to ensure, how are the people of New Zealand going to have confidence that that power is not going to be just completely unhindered by any kind of control, that the decisions being made are going to be appropriate and not political decisions, and that ministers and all politicians, but ministers in this case, who can be very prone to lobbying on a number of issues, are going to put that aside, because Labour members believe there should be criteria. If you're going to have this power, and there's a question over whether you should have this power, then there should be criteria so people can see clearly and transparently how those decisions are going to be made. Maybe Mr Woodhouse could tell us why there are no such criteria in this piece of legislation. Now, for someone who had a lot to say for himself not that long ago, he's gone very, very, very quiet now. Now he's doing that whole I'm looking up at the gallery thing. I didn't really hear what you had to say. We do a little bit of a quirky smile. It's all textbook. We've seen it all before, Mr Woodhouse. But maybe instead of pretending like you're waving to some constituents up in the gallery, could answer the questions that I'm putting, which is why are there no criteria? Oh, Ms Goodhue's getting upset. Levies. There, are you happy? I said the word levies. Maybe Mr Woodhouse could answer the questions about why there are no criteria in this legislation for the power that we're giving the Minister. Does she know? Does she care? No, not really. She just wants to go home. She's just upset that we can't just roll over and let them pass this terrible piece of legislation, which is going to be incredibly damning for all New Zealanders, Mr Chair. And maybe Ms Goodhue could stand up and explain why it is, and I think this is a very simple question, why it is that someone who uses up all their holidays gets to have ACC and someone who doesn't take them can't? How is that fair? So no one knows when they're going to have an accident. No one can predict when they're going to have an accident.